Is that what generosity is, going beyond your means? Is it a genuineness of heart, a real eagerness, earnestness of the heart to do something out of sincerity? There's no pressure, Paul says, to give generously. I like that. I mean, at least when you give, don't do it out of pressure on you. And I like this fair balance between your present abundance and their need. I think that is a great definition of generosity for what Paul is talking about today. You know, couldn't help but, I was in seminary, and I always went to a coffee shop with a friend of mine, Garrett Schindler, and Garrett and I had some really cool conversations about seminary, about theology. We love to have deep discussions about Luther, not necessarily with a beer in hand, but with a coffee in hand. And we would sit there going back and forth across the table about Luther, about Reformed tradition, Melanchthon, and going on and on and on about the Reformed faith. And he wasn't much, I don't remember if he was much into the Reformed faith, which is surprising. A lot of seminarians weren't very much into the whole Reformed faith. But we would talk about poverty, we'd talk about homelessness, and then we would talk about giving. And one of the things it would come down to is, I was trained in philosophy, so my question is this: why do people give? Why do people give generously? Why do people give at all? We were talking about these deep discussions about how is our hearts oriented? When we give, what is the object that we're giving to? Do we love that object that we give to? Do we do it out of obedience, out of duty? Do we give 10% because we have to, or because we want to, or because the Lord is, telling us to? And we were getting into all these really awesome, deep discussions. And then a homeless guy, remember this day we were at a coffee shop in Louisville, and a homeless guy walked by. And my friend, without hesitating, got up from the table and went out, and he gave all he had to that homeless guy. And I basically watched him out the window. I looked at him at the window curiously, and, saw the exchange, and the homeless man was crying and kind of really elated that he had something that day from a friend of mine. And my friend kind of walked back in, slowly walked back in and sat down. And I said, why did you give that money? All you had, it was like $10. We as seminarians weren't that wealthy to begin with, so I just want to clarify that. We were very poor. But he gave $10, all he had, to that homeless man. And the first thing I said, which maybe some of you have said before, have asked yourselves, or maybe you had talked with your friends, they're going to use it on booze. You remember that? That whole thing with, growing up, maybe you got at that. That was my first thing, because, you're skeptical. You're suspicious of people. When you let go of your cash or let go of something, you're skeptical. You're, at least not all people. I was that day. But my friend kind of gave me a different view of things, and I said, why'd you give that money to that homeless guy? I'm sure he's going to use it on whatever, drugs, booze, whatever. And he said, because I don't have to worry about what he's going to use it for. All I have to do is give out of the generosity of my heart. That's all I have control of, is my heart. And I was like, ooh, okay. So you don't have control over what that guy does with your money, and you have just control over your heart. And I said, did you give it because you really wanted to? And he goes, yeah, I really felt love. I really felt the love of the Lord in my heart to give. And I generously, so I did. And I want us to kind of explore this question today. What is involved in being a generous person, or having one's heart oriented toward God? Does the generosity come from a heart that realizes it has enough, or abundance, as Paul says? And then you look at others who don't have much, or they're in need of having more, so you give what you have to that person? Paul appeals to the Christians in Corinth to complete the collection for the dear saints in Jerusalem. That's the context of this passage. Paul holds dear to his heart those beloved saints in Jerusalem. and is calling the Corinthians to renew their commitment to joyfully help out their brothers and sisters in Jerusalem. I remember when I was in seminary, my dad and my mom would write a letter to me with a little cash in it, and they would always say, I pray that you're growing in your faith and your joy is abounding and you're steadfast in your faith. I just remember those letters, and I still have a few of those letters to this day. And you know what? That generosity, not so much, my parents would write beautiful letters to me in seminary, and I really prized and cherished those letters because there were some difficult times in seminary that I had. I mean, my faith was being challenged. The very foundations of my life were being shaken. And I would look forward I would anticipate those letters. And I would go over to the mail room where, what was his name? Gus? I can't remember his name. He was a nice guy. I really liked talking to the mail guy, and we would talk, and then he'd give me the letter that I was anticipating getting from my parents, and I'd open it with profound joy and gratitude, and there's a little bit of cash, and then there was a beautiful letter that I cherished and read over and over and over. The believers, this is what I love. The Corinthians' gift will maximize the saints' joy in Jerusalem, help fellow believers, and bring honor and praise to God. Chapters 8 and 9, Paul has been appealing to the Corinthians to complete what they started regarding the collection for the impoverished and persecuted saints in Jerusalem. As you engage the text, I want you to think about this. You as the reader can see how the Corinthians had allowed that collection to languish, and Paul is encouraging them to renew it and to give generously to it. Sometimes I think we languish in our churches with giving and stewardship, and pastors are afraid to talk about stewardship. I'm not one of those. I'll just talk to you about it. You know, whatever you think, you think. But I think it's important. Now, do I want to preach on it because I have to, because it's Stewardship Month? No. I think we should preach on it more than once a month, but that's me. I think it should be an ongoing discussion because it's important. In 2 Corinthians 8 and 9, Paul continues to emphasize the offering for the Jerusalem church, encouraging the Corinthian Christians to arrange ahead of time this generous gift that you promised before. When a radical giver is generous, they go beyond themselves, I think, forgetting their own comfort, convenience, and they give through faith and trust in God, with the desire to see their neighbors, their communities, their jobs, the economy transformed and restored. And it's based on love, a radical, generous love. And it doesn't come from greed or like wanting to hoard your money and control it. It comes from a place of deep love, not a place of deep anxiety. And I think I saw my friend that day give from a deep place, Garrett, what I was saying earlier about the coffee shop. He gave from a deep sense of love and joy, and I was coming from a deep place of anxiety and fear. It was interesting, the difference. Christians, Paul makes crystal clear, don't give under compulsion, which refers to external pressure or coercion. Do you ever feel like you had to give under pressure, guilt, or fear? I remember growing up, there are some times where, parents, I was thinking of my friends' parents giving, not necessarily always the mother or the father giving to their kids or children, not because they necessarily truly wanted to, but because those kids were in deep financial trouble and they couldn't hold down a job or they couldn't buy their own groceries, so their parents stepped in and stepped up to help relieve them of some of that financial load and pressure and to pay the rent at the apartment they were staying at. I didn't ever necessarily see joy or gratitude when these parents would give to their kids. They almost did it out of kind of a complaining, begrudging way, like, honey, I'm trying to remember my friend, Jason, why can't you learn to budget your finances better? Why can't you learn to save? Why can't you take two jobs rather than one job? Why do we have to keep bailing you out of this financial problem, bail you out of this problem, and bail you out of this problem? Does that sound familiar? I don't know if you've experienced that. I don't know. Just wanted to share that with you. Maybe it would help you feel not alone in that struggle. So Christians, Paul makes clear, don't give under compulsion, which refers to guilt or coercion, quite possibly accompanied by legalism. Believers are strongly warned by Paul not to give based on the demands of others or according to arbitrary standards or set amounts necessarily. However, Paul supports those joyful Christians or Corinthians to be cheerful givers, and the Greek word for cheerful is the word which we get hilarious. Do you ever give hilariously? Do you ever give like you're laughing when you give generously? You're like, yeah. You ever do that? Or scream maybe? Which suggests that God loves a heart that is enthusiastically thrilled with the pleasure of giving. And I think that's why stewardship is not looked upon as, ooh, fun and a creative and really exciting time. It's kind of like, maybe it's the way we were brought up in the church. Gosh, he's asking for more money. The church is asking for more. And I can understand your I think, concern, because there are times where I give to my seminary or give to something, and you know what they say? They don't necessarily get back to me saying, thank you for your generous donation. You know what they say? We want more. You have more to give. So we need to be in a place of being thrilled and exciting. Paul, therefore, is saying, don't grumble or complain when you give of your time, tithes, or talents. Don't be unhappy. Be carefree and even playful and creative when you give generously. And I think that's something we as pastors and churches need to do. We need to give in a playful, generous, creative way where we're feeling joyful rather than anxious. It is interesting as we look at Paul's teachings about generous giving in this text. The one component of generous giving that stands out to me as the reader is the underlying emphasis on motive for giving generously. Give out of sincerity. Do we give honestly? Write that down today. That's my question. Look at yourself when you give. Look at your motives. Look at your hearts. How are your hearts oriented? When you give generously, do you second guess yourself later? That's a good kind of test to take. Later, do you feel horrible when you give? Do you kind of feel like, gosh, that did not feel good to give? The old adage, give till it hurts. I don't like that. Christian Miller, in his work, he's a philosopher, and he wrote an article on generosity. And I was a philosophy major at Mount Mercy University, and I loved philosophy, but I realized I couldn't do anything with it. And so, other than go to law school, and I was actually contemplating that at one time. But Christian Miller, in his work, has discovered there are 3 requirements we have to meet to qualify as a generous person. Let's pursue his philosophical shelf to see his insights on the matter, and let's look into this. This is what he says. This is a hypothetical, okay? First comes donating something of value to you. Consider the following example. This is the hypothetical he gave. Jones has completely lost interest in the CDs in his car. He hasn't played them in years or a long time, and they're just gathering dust. Are you with me? One day, he happens to drive by a Goodwill collection center and decides that it would be nice to get rid of them, so he drops them off. Miller looks at this hypothetical example and says he doesn't want to find fault with what Jones did. It is praiseworthy, and Goodwill can put the donation to good use. But is his donation generous? That's the question Miller asks. Miller says no. If Jones had still been attached to the CDs and thought that donating them could do some good in the world, then that would be one thing. But he lost all attachment to them years ago. Is Jones then saying, this is my thought, that generosity means you love something and are attached to that object, and you decide to part ways with it when you love it and are attached to it, and that's generosity? Or on the reverse side, if you're uninterested in that object that you gave away or give away, and you haven't used it for a long time, and you give it away to someone else, does that qualify as being ungenerous? Let's explore the heart and motives of the giver as we look at dedicating our hearts to God on this Sunday. First, write this down. What kind of heart do you have when you give? Now, the first thing I'm going to point out, since I'm a philosophy major, is self-interest. Egoism is called in philosophical terms. There are different types Psychological egoism, which Ayn Rand got into with the Fountainhead and all of her books on capitalism. Do we give out of a sense of self-interest? Does it really benefit us when we give generously? That's a good question. Explore that motive with me. As a Christian or as someone who gives at church, do you give because somehow it benefits you? You get something better. Maybe it's, what do I mean? Let's break that word benefit down. Is it a benefit, cost benefits analysis? You get more benefit out of the whole exchange. Somehow the generous giver gives for the sake of benefiting themselves and getting a personal payoff for their generosity. Maybe it's a psychological payoff. I feel happier. I feel good giving. And that's maybe based on self-interest. I feel really good that I gave today to the church. It relieves my burdensome conscience. It gets rid of some unnecessary guilt or maybe fear. Maybe it gets me out of this fear-driven world that I'm living in. Maybe I'm escaping damnation or punishment as I give. Maybe it's some kind of eternal payoff. Ooh. Have you ever thought of that? Why do we give? Some people give out of self-interest because of needing public recognition. There's some politicians or some people that give based, that's not necessarily on altruistic motives, giving for the sake of the other, right? Benefiting the other, but because it gives them more votes. Maybe some give because of public recognition, a certain tax break, and sometimes a show of their economic status and power. Does this sound familiar? Does the gift of generosity still benefit others and the community? Sure it does. Yet the person who's generous giver isn't necessarily doing it for the sake of the other person or impoverished community or the saints of Jerusalem. These people give at times out of fear of hell, maybe by giving substantially to others, they believe they will somehow buy their way out of a sticky or troublesome situation. Now, this is a very, cynical perspective, but capitalism runs sometimes on cynicism. It runs on self-interest and competition. And sometimes we give because it's out of self-interest, right? How many of you give out of self-interest? Check your motives at the door. See what you think. The second way our heart is oriented toward giving generously is through the motive of altruism. How many of you really give to benefit the other? That is your primary reason for giving, is the other. You're doing it for the sake of the other. This means that when someone gives generously in the church out of their hearts and they dedicate their hearts to God, they are acting out of pure altruistic motives that care for the well-being of those who would be helped, regardless of whether the donor will benefit in the process. If she does, Miller says, that's great. But if she doesn't, that is okay too. Her benefit is not the point. So C. Daniel Batson from the University of Kansas has conducted extensive research on altruistic acts and has discovered that altruistic motivation exists. Batson has found that if you empathize with, say, other people's suffering, you are more likely to help them, and there's a good chance that your motivation will be altruistic. So you maybe have to, sympathize. You see that their situation is similar to your own, so you give for altruistic reasons. Here are some examples of altruism. Write this down. Now, before I get into this, the big thing in my seminary, undergrad, my professors would always say, altruistic motives. Yeah, when a mother sees her child in the lake or the river and they're drowning and the mother just, without thinking, without calculating the costs and benefits, jumps in to save that child. That's an extreme situation. It doesn't happen all the time. But that's what philosophy professors are always good at putting out there, extreme hypothetical cases. But my question is I think in the church, let's take that extreme case out where the mother jumps in to save her drowning daughter, drowning son. That's altruism. Let's just say convenience. I think we really can look at altruism when it's inconvenience, when we're uncomfortable. That's one way to, I think, sometimes establishing altruism is, do we feel, is there a risk in giving to this person? Does it harm us? Does it benefit us? Doing something to help another person with no expectation of reward, write that down. Foregoing things that may bring personal benefits if they create costs for others. Helping someone despite personal costs or risks. sharing resources in the face of scarcity, showing concern for someone else's well-being. That's just an example of altruism. As we look at Miller again, his work helps us to understand generosity and certain requirements for generosity. He deems acts of generosity as holding these important aspects, and he asks these essential questions of generosity. A, is there evidence that the gift was important to the person, that she or he cared about it in some way? Let me say that again. A, is there evidence that the gift was important to the person, okay, that she or he cared about it in some way? B, does the person tend to give even when external rewards such as publicity or tax benefits do not come into play? C, does the person seem to be donating out of a sense of obligation, or is this a free gift of money and time and talents that she could have used in other ways? The biblical standard of giving generously starts with the understanding and realization that everything we own and possess comes from God as a gift to be shared with the world and others. Those who have enough don't hoard their objects, they share them with those who are less fortunate, less off. Certain people with power and privilege in Corinth sought wealth, and these people exhausted themselves in Corinth, getting wealthy and rich. According to Brian McLaren, people worked hard and exploited their neighbors, their land, while others got poor and went without in Corinth. Those we find in Corinth that gave generously knew God's generous outpouring of love in their personal lives, and they saw God's generosity all around them in the faces they met, the nature that they loved and was in awe of. And you know what? They gave out of a forgetful heart. They didn't think about themselves. They were filled with joy, and they were filled with joy. It says, be a cheerful giver. And they were. A lot of these were cheerful givers. Each man or woman should give what he has decided in his heart to give, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. Paul, as Andy Stanley writes, doesn't offer any calculations of gross and net, nor does he share depreciation schedules or dividend tables. He just says to give whatever you decide in your heart to give, but do it with joy and gratitude. Do we do that? Paul draws the conviction that a truly generous person is one who receives in return gifts from God and men out of proportion to his own giving. Nevertheless, Paul insists that true generosity arises from a free heart that forgets prudential calculations. Two things result for the godly giver for Paul. Write these down. The needs of worthy persons are met, and two, the recipients are led through the gifts to praise God. That is a godly, radical giver. Ultimately, God receives the glory and praise from the recipients who receive the generous gifts. Now, let me just break this down and make more sense. The first is a self-interested giver, psychological egoism. Let me just say this. Let's just get rid of psychological egoism. Just say this. The first giver's heart is oriented to themselves, right? It's just they're based on greed. It's based sometimes on public recognition. It's based on a tax break. It's based on this. It's based on this. The second giver is altruistic. They're focused on their neighbor. Love your neighbor as yourself. That's the altruistic giver, right? Maybe you think about that. And then the last giver that I'm talking about is the godly giver, the one who gives from the top and not the bottom. This is the kind of giver that gives radically for the sake of giving God the glory and praise, okay? That's what their hearts are oriented toward God and God alone. And what I love about this is, let me finish it up with this. And this is what, I love this. Andy Stanley goes on to say this. When you give with a heart that is oriented toward God and give out of abundance rather than scarcity, you give not out of compulsion, which is an impulsive response to a request. It can be accompanied by, this kind of pressured, coercive giving can be based on guilt, it can be based on fear, it can be based on what you see others doing, and then you have to conform to what the Joneses are doing because you don't want to miss out. No, but the more your heart is occupied with the burden of meeting your own needs, the less it can entertain God's promptings to be generous, according to Andy Stanley. You don't give because everyone else is giving. You give because you're free in Christ. Here's the challenge for today. There are two types of givers, according to Andy Stanley. And this is interesting. As I was reading Stanley's, people who give what's left over and people who give off the top and live on what's left over. I think that's interesting. I've never read something like that. People who give what's left over and people who give off the top and lived on what's left over. I'm the person who probably gives what's left over. I'm honest with myself. I think if I'm honest, truly honest with myself, I think there are times where I can be very self-interested. I mean, I'm just going to confess that. There are times where I can be altruistic, and there are times where I can be just God-oriented. And sometimes we're all of these things. I'm the person who gives what's left over. The first group sees themselves as responsible for meeting their own needs. These are the self-interested givers, and whatever is left over goes to help God's work. Do you know anyone like that? The second group sees everything as belonging to God, including the responsibility to meet their daily needs. Therefore, they're free to take on the mission of stewarding God's resources as their generosity dictates. Generosity is their priority, although they don't give ceaselessly. They give thoughtfully and effortlessly. The problem with giving leftovers is that your generosity can never exceed your ability to meet your own needs. If you prosper, there may be some left over, but the minute you face financial uncertainty, generosity takes a back seat. For the people in that second group that Stanley talks about, the generous givers, giving off the top is only logical. They understand that God owns and controls it all. They feel free to invest in his interests first and their own needs second. It's a rational thing to do, they say. The self-interested giver fits Andy Stanley's first type of giver who gives what's left over because the self-interested giver is more concerned with satisfying their own needs first before they give to others. And there's nothing right or wrong about this. I'm not going to make a judgment. This is just what he's saying. So you decide what you think. The second type of giver Stanley presents is what I call the godly giver, who gives off the top and they make it their priority to tithe 10% to God. Everything else takes a back seat. This kind of giver gives without any expectation of reward or getting anything in return other than praising God and glorifying God and giving thanks to God for the gifts that he's given them. Here's the application today. Next time you give generously, ask yourself, what is the motivation for giving generously? How is your heart oriented toward God, your possessions, and the natural earth? What motivates your giving? Is it self-oriented? To look good, feel good, other-oriented, serving neighbors in need who are exploited, poor, and discriminated against? Or God-oriented, praising him alone and serving him alone and enjoying him forever in our hearts? Consciously aware that all that we have and see is a gift from his hand. Consciously aware that all we have is a gift from his hand. Uncover the motive behind the giving, and you will see what's at the heart, the root of your heart. What you really care about and what you don't care about. What is really preoccupying your heart and your mind and what's not. You know what preoccupies my heart and my mind sometimes? Books. Ask my wife. You know? And sometimes I buy books when maybe, too many books, when I should probably be going out and doing something else with my time, my talents, other than reading at home by myself. Just think about that, okay? Let us pray.